The humidity of a Seoul July clung to the skin like a damp veil. But inside the garum auction house, the air was chilled to a precise, preservationist 64 degrees. Janice Vaughn smoothed the front of her deep emerald linen suit, her fingers tracing the texture of the fabric to steady her nerves. 60 years of life had taught her that elegance was often a mask for upheaval. Today marked exactly 5 years since she had buried Marcus, and the grief still sat in her chest like a heavy, unpolished stone. She hadn't come to Korea just to run from the silence of her Brooklyn brownstone. She had come to find the moonlight silk. It was a legendary bolt of 19th century sexilby, rumored to have been woven by a court artisan who had lost her sight. It was said the fabric didn't just catch the light, it inhaled it. Lot 402, the auctioneer announced, his voice a rhythmic drone over the hushed crowd of collectors. The Joseon Moonlight Silk. Bidding starts at 50 million won. Janice raised her paddle without hesitation. Across the aisle, a man sat with the stillness of a statue. Han Gyeol-moon did not look like a man who appreciated the history of a thread. He looked like a man who owned the factory, the land it sat on, and the sky above it. His suit was charcoal, his hair a thick obsidian wave, and his eyes held the weary sharpness of a predator who had already eaten. 70 million, Han Gyeol said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated in the small of Janice's back. Janice didn't look at him. 80. 100, Han Gyeol countered, his tone bored. He didn't even look at the stage. He was checking a gold watch, his thumb stroking the leather strap. To him, this was a transaction. To her, it was a lifeline. 120, Janice said, her voice clear and resonant. A ripple of whispers moved through the room. People began to turn, their eyes flitting between the wealthy titan of Moonhwa Holdings and the tall black woman with silver-spun braids and a gaze like a hawk. Han Gyeol finally turned his head. He looked at her, not with interest, but with a cold, calculating curiosity. He raised his paddle again. 200 million. The room went silent. The price was now absurd, even for a relic. Janice felt a flush of heat. She knew the limit of her savings, the hard-earned fruit of a lifetime of artistry. But she also knew that if this man bought the silk, it would end up in a temperature-controlled vault, never to be touched, never to fulfill its purpose. She stood up. The auctioneer paused, gavel, hovering. Han Gyeol leaned back, a faint, mocking shadow of a smile touching his lips. He expected her to fold. He expected her to realize that against his billions, she was a ghost. Janice didn't look at the auctioneer. She looked directly at the elderly woman sitting in the front row. Mrs. Park, the textile's current guardian, and the last descendant of the weaver. I am not a collector, Janice said, her voice steady despite the thrumming of her pulse. I am a weaver. My hands have calluses from 40 years of honoring the warp and the weft. If this silk goes to Mr. Moon, it will be an asset on a balance sheet. If it comes to me, I will finish the story the weaver started. I will create a masterpiece that breathes again. She turned her gaze to Han Gyeol. For the first time, his expression faltered. The boredom vanished, replaced by a sudden, jarring intensity. Mr. Moon, she said, her voice dropping an octave, you have enough beauty in your life that you've forgotten how to feel it. No, I will not let you buy this just because you can. The silence was deafening. No one spoke to Han Gyeol-moon that way. His assistants behind him looked ready to faint. Janice looked back at Mrs. Park and bowed, a deep, respectful tilt of her body that acknowledged the weight of the history between them. 120 million is my final offer. It is every bit of respect I have to give. Mrs. Park looked at Han Gyeol, who sat frozen. His hand was still on his paddle, but he didn't raise it. He was staring at Janice as if she were a riddle he couldn't solve. He saw the fire in her eyes, a vibrancy that made his own meticulously ordered life look gray and bloodless. Mrs. Park nodded slowly. "The silk belongs to the one who knows its song," she whispered. "Going once, twice, sold." As the room erupted into hushed, frantic gossip, Janice felt the adrenaline ebb, leaving her knees weak. She began to gather her things, her heart still hammering. "You are a very expensive woman to disagree with," a voice said. Janice looked up. Han Gyul was standing 2 feet away. Up close, he was towering, smelling of sandalwood and expensive ink. The lines around his eyes spoke of decades of stress, but his gaze was fixed on her with a hunger that had nothing to do with business. "I didn't do it to be expensive," Janice said, her chin tilting up. "I did it because it was right." "People do not tell me no in this city," Han Gyul remarked, his eyes tracing the line of her throat, the elegance of her silver hair. "They certainly don't do it in public." "Then you've been surrounded by the wrong people, Mr. Moon," Janice replied. She slung her bag over her shoulder, giving him a polite final nod. "Good evening." She walked past him, her stride purposeful. Han Gyul stayed where he was, watching the sway of her emerald suit until she disappeared through the heavy oak doors. For the first time in 20 years, his heart was racing, and for the first time in his life, he didn't care about the money. He only cared about the woman who had dared to win. The Bukshan Hanok village was a labyrinth of history, where the curved black-tiled roofs of traditional houses whispered secrets to the modern skyline of Seoul. Inside her rented studio, a space of aged cedar beams and paper screen windows, Janice was at peace. The moonlight silk lay across her work table like a pool of captured starlight. The rhythmic thud-clack of her hand loom was the only sound until a firm, measured knock echoed against the wood of the outer gate. Janice frowned, setting down her shuttle. She wasn't expecting her tea delivery for another hour. When she slid the door open, the peace of the studio was instantly disrupted by the sheer gravitational pull of the man standing in the courtyard. Han Gyul Moon looked out of place against the rustic stone and climbing ivy. He had traded his suit for a navy cashmere sweater that looked soft enough to melt, but his expression remained as sharp as a diamond. "Mr. Moon," Janice said, leaning against the doorframe, her arms crossed, "I'm assuming you didn't walk all these hills just to see the moonlight silk." Han Gyul let his gaze wander over her, from her ink-stained fingers to the way the silver in her hair caught the afternoon sun. "I have found that things won at auction are rarely as interesting as the person who won them," he said, his voice dropping into that low, resonant register. "May I come in?" Janice hesitated, then stepped aside. "It's a working studio. Watch the charcoal." He entered, moving with a surprising predatory grace. He didn't hover. He gravitated toward the looms. He looked at the skeins of hand-dyed wool and the intricate tapestries in progress. "I've spent my life building things out of steel, glass, and code," he said, standing before a piece Janice had titled Grief in Indigo. "I've forgotten what it's like to make something that remembers the touch of a human hand." "Then why are you here, Han Gyul?" she asked, using his name for the first time. The sound of it made him turn. "I want to sponsor your exhibition," he said. "The Moon Hua Foundation is looking for a centerpiece for the Autumn Gala. I want it to be you. Full creative control. No budget limit." Janice let out a soft, cynical laugh. "You want to own the woman who said no. You want to wrap me in a corporate contract so you can feel like you won the auction after all." Han Gyul stepped closer, the scent of sandalwood and rain-dampened earth following him. "Is that what you think of me? A man who only knows how to sign checks?" "I think you're a man who uses his power as a shield," Janice replied, her voice steady. She reached out and grabbed a handful of raw, unprocessed silk from a basket, thrusting it toward him. "Here, feel this." He looked startled but reached out. His long, elegant fingers brushed against hers as he took the fiber. The contact was electric. a sudden, sharp heat that made Janice's breath hitch. "It's rough," he murmured, his thumb moving over the fibers. "Because it hasn't been refined yet," Janice explained, her voice softening despite herself. "That's what you don't understand, Mr. Moon. You like the finished product, the shine. But the beauty is in the tension, the struggle of the thread against the loom. If the tension is too loose, the fabric is weak. Too tight, and it breaks. It's a delicate balance, just like people." Han-gyeol didn't look at the silk. He looked at her. The corporate mask he wore didn't just slip, it shattered. For a moment, she saw the exhaustion behind his eyes, the heavy loneliness of a man who had built a kingdom but had no one to sit on the throne with. "Teach me," he whispered. "Teach me the tension." The air in the small studio grew thick, charged with a sudden, mature hunger. It wasn't the flighty passion of youth. It was the deep, resonant recognition of two souls who had survived the winter and were looking for a reason to believe in spring. By the time they stepped out of the studio, the sun had set, and a light, misty rain had begun to fall over Seoul. Han-gyeol insisted on walking her to the main road. The streets were slick, reflecting the amber glow of the lanterns and the neon signs of the distant city. They walked in a comfortable, heavy silence, the kind that only comes when the small talk has been burned away. As they reached the corner where his car waited, Han-gyeol stopped. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face before he gently tucked a stray silver lock behind her ear. His touch was lingering, his skin warm against the cool mist of the rain. Janice looked up at him, her heart doing something it hadn't done since Marcus died. It beat with the terrifying rhythm of hope. Han-gyeol's gaze was intense, searching hers. He looked at her with a raw vulnerability that terrified them both. It was the look of a man who realized he was about to risk his carefully constructed empire for a woman he had only just met, and the look of a woman who realized that her quiet retirement was over. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice a mere vibration in the damp air. "I'll be back tomorrow." "I'll be working," Janice replied, her voice trembling slightly. "I know," he smiled, a real, devastatingly handsome smile that reached his eyes. "I'll bring the tea." He watched her walk away into the mist, his hand still feeling the ghost of her skin. In the heart of the ancient village, the billionaire and the artist had found the one thing money couldn't buy, a thread they were both afraid to pull and even more afraid to let go. The transition from the steel and glass cacophony of Seoul to the windswept basalt shores of Jeju Island felt like a deep collective exhale. Han-gyeol's private jet had been a marvel of silent luxury, but it was the island itself. The scent of tangerine groves and the sharp, briny kiss of the East China Sea that brought the color back to Janice's cheeks. The volcanic soil here produces a specific shade of indigo, Han-gyeol explained, his voice losing its corporate edge as they walked through the gardens of his sprawling estate. The house was a masterpiece of stone and cedar, tucked into a cliffside where the waves crashed against the black rocks below. "I thought it might be useful for your moonlight silk." Janice looked at him, her eyes crinkling at the corners. She wore a flowing cream duster that caught the wind. "You're a terrible liar, Han-gyeol. You didn't bring me here for the dye. You brought me here because you wanted to see if I'd still say no to you when there's no audience." Han-gyeol stopped walking. He reached out, his hand hovering near her elbow before he let it drop. A ghost of a smile appeared. "Perhaps. Or perhaps I simply wanted to see you in a place that matches your scale." They spent the afternoon in a small, traditional workshop on the property. Janice's hands were soon stained a pale, ghostly blue as she worked with the fermented indigo vats. Han-gyeol didn't just watch. He rolled up the sleeves of his white linen shirt and helped her stir the dye, his movements clumsy but earnest. For a few hours, they weren't the billionaire chairman and the renowned artist. They were just two people, hands stained blue, chasing a color. As the sun began to dip, painting the sky in bruised purples and burnt oranges, they moved to the terrace. The air grew cool, and Han Gyeol draped a heavy wool throw over Janice's shoulders. "Does it ever get quiet?" Janice asked softly, looking out at the horizon. "In your head? Or is it always just the Empire?" Han Gyeol leaned against the stone railing, his profile sharp against the fading light. "It is a golden cage, Janice. People think wealth is a door, but for me, it has been a wall. I have spent 30 years being a title, a stock price, a legacy. Sometimes I wake up and wonder if there is a man left under the suit." He turned to her, his gaze raw. "Until the auction. You looked at me like I was just a man who was in your way. It was the most honest thing I've felt in decades." Janice reached out, her blue-stained fingers gently touching the back of his hand. "I know about walls," she whispered. "Losing Marcus. It was like losing my shadow. For 5 years, I've been living in a house with no mirrors because I didn't recognize the woman left behind. It's a phantom limb pain. You keep reaching for something that isn't there until you forget how to use the hand you still have." The vulnerability between them was thick, a tangible thread of shared survival. They were two people who had reached the sunset of their lives only to find that the light was more beautiful than the noonday sun ever was. Han Gyeol stepped closer, closing the distance until the heat from his body shielded her from the sea breeze. He placed his hands on her waist, not with the entitlement of a mogul, but with the reverence of a man touching something fragile and holy. "Janice," he breathed, his forehead resting against hers. When he finally kissed her, it wasn't the frantic, shallow heat of youth. It was a slow, deep reclamation. It tasted of the tangerines they had peeled earlier and the salt from the spray of the ocean. It was a kiss that carried the weight of their combined 115 years. The grief, the triumphs, the loneliness, and the sudden, terrifying joy of being seen. Janice wound her arms around his neck, her fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of his neck. In that moment, the billion-dollar companies and the art world accolades ceased to exist. There was only the sound of the tide, the scent of Jeju blue, and the realization that their second act was going to be the masterpiece of their lives. The Seoul skyline was a jagged crown of neon and glass, but from the 80th floor of the Moonhwa Tower, the city looked like a silent, sprawling circuit board. Han Gyeol's penthouse was a cathedral to minimalism. It was a space of sharp right angles, polished white marble, and shadowless lighting. It was a home where nothing was out of place because, until Janice, nothing had truly been lived in. "It's like living inside a cold diamond, Han Gyeol," Janice remarked on her third morning there. She stood in the center of the vast living area, draped in a vibrant, hand-dyed indigo kimono she had fashioned from their Jeju experiments. In her hands, she carried a heavy roll of bogolonfini, traditional Malian mudcloth. With a practiced flick of her wrists, she draped the textile over the back of a charcoal gray Italian leather sofa. The effect was instantaneous. The deep, earthy browns and geometric cream patterns of the cloth acted like a heartbeat in the sterile room. Han Gyeol emerged from his study, his silk tie loosened, a tablet in hand. He stopped, his gaze moving from the ancient African patterns to the woman who had placed them there. "My interior designer would have a heart attack," he said, though his voice lacked any real bite. "Your interior designer was afraid of your ego," Janice countered, walking toward him. She began to replace a singular $1 million porcelain vase on the sideboard with a tactile, hand-woven basket filled with raw, colorful silk cocoons. "You don't need more things that look like money. You need things that look like breath." He set his tablet down, the corporate world of mergers and hostile takeovers suddenly feeling like a faint buzzing in another room. He watched as she moved through his space, hanging a small, intricate tapestry of sunset-hued threads near the window. She was curating his life, and for a man who controlled everything, the surrender was intoxicating. The sensuality of their age was not a frantic thing. It was found in the unhurried grace of their mornings. It was the way Han-gyeol learned to appreciate the ritual of the pour-over coffee Janice made. The smell of roasted beans cutting through the filtered, scentless air of the penthouse. "You're staring," Janice said softly, catching his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling glass. "I am realizing," he replied, moving behind her, "that I have spent 55 years looking at the world, but I have only been seeing it for the last 3 weeks. He placed his hands on her shoulders, his thumbs tracing the line of her collarbone through the silk. There was no rush to reach the bedroom. They navigated the heat between them with the patience of people who knew that the anticipation was its own masterpiece. They spent hours in the kitchen, not ordering from the Michelin-starred restaurants below, but tasting simple things: slices of ripe pear, a sharp, aged cheese, the heat of a shared bowl of dakjuk. In the quiet intervals between conversation, they found a comfort that would have bored their younger selves. It was the luxury of silence that didn't need to be filled. Janice would sketch designs for her exhibition while Han-gyeol read, his stockinged feet occasionally brushing against hers under the table. "Does it scare you?" she asked one evening, her head resting on his shoulder as they watched the lights of the Han River flicker like fallen stars. "How much has changed in such a short time?" Han-gyeol turned his head, kissing the silver-threaded hair at her temple. "What scares me, Janice, is the thought that I might have died in this beautiful, empty box without ever knowing that color felt like this." He turned her in his arms, his touch firm and grounded. The connection was deep, a slow-burning fire that didn't flicker in the wind. As they stood amidst the glass and the steel, surrounded by the vibrant textiles of her heritage and the quiet strength of his, the penthouse finally felt like a home. But as they held each other, the red light of a camera drone flickered outside the window for a split second before vanishing into the night. The first sign that the world outside was not ready to let their private masterpiece remain a secret. The morning had begun with the scent of jasmine tea and the soft, percussive sound of Janice's loom. But by noon, the air in the penthouse had turned brittle. The bubble didn't just leak, it shattered with the clinical precision of a glass shard. The elevator chimed, and Moon Ji-ah, the CFO of Moonhwa Holdings and Han-gyeol's younger sister, stepped into the living room. She was a woman composed of sharp angles and expensive tailoring, her eyes scanning the room like a thermal imager. She stopped dead when she saw the Bogolan Fini mudcloth draped over the Menotti sofa. "I thought the security reports were exaggerating," Gia said, her voice a cool, modulated blade. She didn't look at Janice at first. She looked at her brother, who was sitting at the breakfast bar with a relaxed posture Gia hadn't seen in a decade. "You've turned the penthouse into a craft fair, Han-gyeol, and during the most sensitive merger in our company's history." Han-gyeol stood, his face instantly hardening into the mask of the chairman. "Ji-ah, you weren't invited." "I am the CFO," she snapped, finally turning her gaze to Janice. Her eyes drifted over Janice's silver hair and the ink on her fingers with a disdain that was both cultural and corporate. "This distraction is all over the blind items on the boards. A foreign artist? At your age? The German board members at Steiner Goetz are already asking questions about your stability. They want a leader, not a man having a late-life crisis with a woman who doesn't even speak the language of his business." Janice felt the heat of the insult, but she didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her hand resting on the back of the loom. "I speak the language of his humanity, Ms. Moon. Perhaps that's why you don't recognize it." Gia's jaw tightened. Humanity doesn't close billion-dollar mergers. Discretion does. Before Han-gyeol could retaliate, his phone chimed. Simultaneously, Janice's phone buzzed on the work table. It was a text from her daughter, Simone. I'm at Incheon, taking a taxi to your studio. We need to talk. Now. 2 hours later, the Bookshawn studio felt like a courtroom. Simone was a younger, fiercer reflection of Janice. A high-powered attorney with the same sharp wit, but none of her mother's current softness. She stood amidst the vibrant silks, her arms crossed over her chest, her eyes red-rimmed from the long flight and even longer resentment. I saw the photos, Mom, Simone said, her voice trembling. The paparazzi shots. You're all over the internet, tucked under the arm of some Korean billionaire, like a trophy. Simone, please sit down, Janice said, reaching for her daughter's hand. Simone pulled away. 5 years, Mom. It's been 5 years since Dad died. 5 years since we stood over that grave and promised to keep his memory alive. And now I find out you're living in some glass tower with a man who could buy and sell our entire neighborhood. Did Marcus Vaughn mean that little to you? That is unfair, and you know it, Janice said, her voice low and dangerous. Your father was the love of my life. But he is gone, Simone. And I am still breathing. I am still a woman with blood in my veins. He's a stranger, Simone cried. He's a world away from everything we are. Do you really think a man like that, a man with that kind of power, actually sees you? Or are you just a vibrant addition to his collection, like one of these rugs? The words cut deeper than anything Gia had said. Simone wasn't attacking Janice's status. She was attacking the validity of her heart. The door to the studio creaked open. Han Gyul stood there. He had followed Janice, unable to let her face the storm alone. He saw the two women, the mirror images of strength and pain, and he felt the weight of the worlds he was trying to bridge. Simone turned, her eyes landing on Han Gyul. So, this is him, the man who thinks he can replace my father. Han Gyul bowed, a gesture of profound respect that seemed to catch Simone off guard. I could never replace a man who helped build the woman I love, he said quietly. I only wish to be the one who stands beside her for the rest of the journey. Don't give me the press release, Simone spat, though her voice wavered. The tension in the room was a physical thing, a thread pulled so tight it was screaming. Janice looked at Han Gyul, then at her daughter, then at the moonlight silk on the loom. The fabric was beautiful, but today it felt heavy. For the first time since she arrived in Seoul, Janice felt the phantom limb pain of her widowhood return, sharper than ever. She saw the corporate guillotine Gia was preparing, and she saw the grief-stricken wall Simone was building. The thread wasn't just fraying, it was beginning to snap. I think, Janice said, her voice brittle as dried parchment, that everyone needs to leave. I need to be alone with my work. Janice! Han Gyul started, stepping toward her. Please, she said, not looking at him. As the room emptied, leaving only the scent of stressed silk and old wood, Janice sat at her loom. She picked up a shuttle, but her hands were shaking too hard to weave. The masterpiece was in danger, and for the first time, she wasn't sure if she was brave enough to finish the pattern. The air in the Moon family's ancestral estate was thick with the scent of pine needles and old money. For this evening's trial by fire, Janice had chosen her armor with the precision of a master weaver. She wore a floor-length column dress of heavy, midnight black silk, overlaid with a hand-painted gold leaf pattern that mimicked the flow of a river. Around her neck sat a bold, sculptural bronze necklace from a Ghanaian artisan. She didn't look like a distraction. She looked like a queen from a dynasty they hadn't yet studied. Han Gyul reached for her hand as they stood before the heavy oak doors of the private dining hall. His palm was warm, but his jaw was set in a line of iron. They will use words like duty and legacy, he whispered. Do not let them make you feel small. You're the only thing in this house that is truly alive. They entered to find the table already set for hanjeong-sik, a traditional full-course meal. At the head sat Grandmother Moon, a woman whose fragile frame belied a soul made of tempered steel. To her right was Minjung Kang, the 35-year-old heiress to Kang Electronics. She was the logical choice, the merger in human form. The meal was a symphony of coldness. Every dish was served with a side of pointed subtext. The moonlight silk is a beautiful acquisition, Han-gyeol, Grandmother Moon said, her voice like dry parchment. She didn't look at Janice, but a piece of fabric cannot secure the Steiner-Goetz merger. The Kang family, however, brings more than just texture to the table. Minjing smiled, a practiced corporate curve of the lips. We all have hobbies, Chairman. My mother collects Ming vases. I understand the appeal of the artsy and the exotic, but when the sun sets, we must return to the business of the empire. Janice set her chopsticks down with a delicate click. The silence that followed was heavy. A hobby is what you do to pass the time, Miss Kang, Janice said, her voice calm and resonant, carrying the authority of a woman who had lived twice as long as the heiress. Art is what we do to make time worth passing. You speak of an empire, but an empire without soul is just a graveyard with better lighting. She turned to Grandmother Moon, meeting the matriarch's icy gaze. I am 60 years old. I have outlived my husband, raised a daughter, and built a legacy with my own 2 hands. I didn't come to Seoul to audition for a role in your company. It just happened that your son remembered how to breathe when he saw me. Can your merger offer him that? The table went dead silent. Han-gyeol's sister, Ji-ah, looked as if she were about to choke on her tea. Enough! Grandmother Moon struck the table. Han-gyeol, this is a scandal. To pass over the Kang alliance for a foreigner who encourages this insolence? If you proceed with this woman, you do not just defy me. You defy the bloodline. You will be stripped of your chairmanship by the end of the quarter. Han-gyeol stood up, the chair screeching against the polished floor. The cold billionaire was gone. In his place was a man on fire. Then strip it, he roared. I have spent 30 years being the son you wanted, the CEO the board demanded, and the ghost of a man you could control. If the price of my legacy is to throw away the only woman who sees me, not my shadow, not my bank account, but me, then the Moonhwa Empire deserves to fall. He grabbed Janice's hand, pulling her up. We're leaving. Han-gyeol, sit down, his mother hissed. No, he said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, quiet clarity. I have spent my life saying yes to people who don't love me. It's time I started saying no to everyone but her. The drive back to the city was a blur of neon lights and heavy, suffocating silence. Janice looked out the window, watching the rain begin to streak the glass. She felt the heat of Han-gyeol's hand on the gear shift, his knuckles white. A terrifying thought began to weave itself into her mind. She loved him, deeply, with the soul-shaking intensity of a second chance. But at what cost? She saw the fortress he had built for himself, and she saw it crumbling because of her. Han-gyeol, she whispered as they pulled into the penthouse garage. Don't, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Don't say you're sorry. Don't say it's too much. But it is, Janice said, turning to him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I'm an artist, Han-gyeol. I know how to mend a tear, but some things are too shredded to fix. Am I asking you to give up your life for a dream? Han-gyeol turned off the engine, the silence of the car wrapping around them. He looked at her. This woman of silver and gold, of strength and sorrow. You aren't asking me for anything, Janice. You're the one giving me a life. For the first time, I'm not just a CEO. I'm a man who is loved, and I'd burn that entire estate to the ground just to keep the fire in your eyes. He kissed her then, a desperate, fierce, beautiful kiss that tasted of salt and defiance. But as Janice held him, she looked up at the towering Moonhwa skyscraper above them and wondered, how long can a fire burn when the whole world is trying to put it out? The dust motes danced in the shafts of late afternoon sun that pierced through the paper screen windows of the Bookchon studio. Janice sat at her loom, her feet working the treadles with a rhythmic, heavy cadence. She was working on a new section of the moonlight silk, weaving in a thread of deep, bruised crimson, the color of a heart that had been broken and mended too many times. The sliding door slammed open. Simone stood there, her trench coat splattered with rain from the sudden soul squall, her face a mask of righteous indignation. "I just saw the headlines, Mom," Simone said, her voice trembling as she held up her phone. The screen showed a grainy photo of Hang Gyol pulling Janice away from his family estate, his face a storm of defiance. "The Korean tabloids are calling you a foreign enchantress, destroying a dynasty. Is this what you wanted? To be the woman who brings down an empire?" Janice didn't stop weaving. Thud clack, thud clack. "I wanted a quiet life, Simone. I didn't ask for the empire. I asked for the man." "But the man is the empire!" Simone stepped further into the room, her heels clicking sharply on the wooden floor. "You're 60 years old. You have a life in Brooklyn. You have a gallery. You have us. And most importantly, you have Dad's memory. How can you throw all that away for a man you've known for a few weeks? It's like you're trying to erase him." Janice finally stopped. She let the shuttle rest. The silence that rushed back into the room was deafening. She turned her stool to face her daughter, her silver hair catching the dying light. "You think I'm erasing Marcus?" Janice asked, her voice dangerously low. "It feels like it. You're wearing silk I've never seen, living in a palace in the sky, and dating a man who looks at you like he discovered fire. It's disrespectful, Mom. It's like you're rewriting the ending of your life and leaving Dad out of the script." Janice stood up. She walked over to a basket of raw wool and picked up a handful. "Look at this, Simone. This is the warp of a fabric. It's the vertical thread. It's the foundation. It's fixed, unmoving, and strong. Your father? He is my warp. He is the reason I am standing here today. He is the foundation of everything I know about love." She then picked up a spool of gold silk. "But this is the weft. It's the thread that moves back and forth. It's the color, the texture, the movement. It's the now." Janice stepped closer to her daughter, her eyes shining with a fierce, ancient clarity. "I spent 35 years being Marcus Vaughn's wife. I spent 28 years being your mother. And for 5 years, I was a widow, a shadow walking through a house of echoes. I have done my duty to the past, Simone. I have cried every tear I had for a man who is never coming back." Simone's lower lip swept out, her eyes filling with tears. "But he loved you so much. And because he loved me so much, he wouldn't want me to spend the next 20 years waiting to die," Janice said, her voice breaking but firm. She reached out, cupping Simone's face with her calloused, ink-stained hands. "I am still alive, Simone. My heart still craves the sun. My skin still feels the heat of a touch. I refuse to be a monument to a ghost. I refuse to be a museum of what used to be, just so you can feel comfortable with your memories." Simone let out a choked sob, the wall of her anger finally crumbling. She looked at her mother, really looked at her, and saw for the first time that Janice wasn't just Mom. She was a woman with a hunger for life that was terrifying and beautiful. She saw the way Janice's shoulders were squared, the way her eyes held a spark that hadn't been there in years. "He makes you happy," Simone whispered. "He makes me feel like a masterpiece in progress, not a finished work gathering dust," Janice replied. Simone leaned her forehead against her mother's shoulder, the scent of cedar and indigo wrapping around them both. "I'm just scared, Mom. I'm scared that if you change too much, I won't know where I fit in." "You are the warp, baby," Janice whispered, stroking Simone's hair. "You are the foundation. Nothing changes that. But let me have my color. Let me have my gold." Outside, the rain stopped, and the clouds parted to reveal a sky the color of a ripening plum. In the quiet of the studio, the two women held each other, the tension finally giving way to a new, fragile understanding. Janice wasn't just a mother anymore. She was a woman claiming her second act, and Simone was finally beginning to realize that her mother's heart was large enough to hold the past, the present, and a billionaire who had given her a reason to feel alive. The peace of the morning was shattered by the blue light of 1,000 screens. Janice had been at her loom, the quiet clicking of the wooden shuttle acting as a metronome for her thoughts, when the first notification chimed, then another, then a flood. By the time she picked up her phone, the hashtag The Black Widow of Bukchon was already trending across Seoul's digital landscape. The photos were masterpieces of manipulation. A shot of Janice at her late husband's funeral, her face a mask of grief, was spliced next to a grainy long-lens photo of her laughing on Han Gyul's private jet. The captions were a poison, from widow to wealth, the American artist, hunting Korea's richest son. Others were more sinister. Doctor documents suggesting Marcus's death had left Janice in debt, framing her romance with Han Gyul as a calculated heist rather than a second chance. "It's a hit piece," Han Gyul said, his voice echoing in the vast marble foyer of the penthouse. Janice turned to see him. He looked like the man she had met at the auction. The man she had hoped was gone. He was buttoned into a three-piece suit of midnight wool. His tie knotted so tight it looked like a tourniquet. His expression was a wall of unreadable stone. "They're saying I'm a predator, Han Gyul," Janice said, her voice steady but her hands trembling. "They're digging up Marcus's medical bills. They're making my life look like a crime scene. My rivals, the Kong family and the Steiner Guts lobbyists, are desperate," Han Gyul replied, his eyes not meeting hers. He was looking at his tablet, his fingers flying across the screen. "They know they can't beat me on the balance sheet, so they are attacking the only thing they think is a weakness, my heart." "And what is the board saying?" Han Gyul finally looked at her, but the warmth she had come to rely on was missing. It was as if a shudder had been drawn over his soul. "The board of directors held an emergency meeting at 4 this morning. They were clear. The merger is at risk. The stock has dropped 4% since the photos leaked. They have given me an ultimatum." Janice felt a cold dread settle in her marrow. The seat or me? "They believe a chairman with a scandalous private life is a liability," he said, his voice dropping into a professional, detached baritone. "They want a public statement, a clarification that our relationship was a short-term cultural consultation, a misunderstanding of friendship." "A lie," Janice whispered. Han Gyul didn't answer. He stepped toward the window, looking out over the city he ruled. "If I lose the chairmanship, the company will be carved up. Thousands of people will lose their livelihoods. My family's legacy will be erased by the very people who created this lie." He turned back to her, but he stayed on the other side of the room. The distance between them felt like a canyon. "I need you to return to the Bukchon studio for a while, Janice, for your safety. The paparazzi are outside the tower. I've increased the security detail at your door, but I cannot be seen with you. Not until this is fixed." "Fixed?" Janice's voice rose, a sharp, resonant sound. "You're talking about me like I'm a line item on a budget, Han Gyul. Are you telling me to hide? Are you retreating?" "I am protecting you," he barked, the first flash of emotion breaking through his icy veneer. "They are calling you a gold digger. They are dragging your husband's name through the mud. If I stand by you now, they will only scream louder. I have to be the CEO the world expects. I have to be cold. I have to be the man who values the company above all else to shut them up." "And in doing that," Janice said, her silver hair catching the morning sun as she stood tall, "you are becoming exactly what they want. You are letting them kill the man I love and replacing him with a ghost in a suit." Han Gyul didn't move to comfort her. He didn't take her hand. He stood with his hands behind his back, a posture of absolute lonely power. Your driver is waiting downstairs. I've arranged for your materials to be moved back to the studio today. We will communicate through my personal assistant. Janice looked at him, the man she had kissed on the shores of Jeju, the man who had tasted of salt and citrus, and saw a stranger. The Ice King had returned to his throne, and the fire she had brought into his life was being systematically extinguished. You're a brilliant businessman, Han-gyul, Janice said, her heart breaking with the weight of the realization. But you've made a terrible trade. You're saving your empire by burning the only thing that made it worth having. She didn't wait for him to respond. She gathered her things, her emerald duster billowing behind her like a battle flag, and walked toward the elevator. As the doors were about to close, she saw Han-gyul standing in the middle of his perfect, sterile marble palace. He didn't look like a king. He looked like a prisoner. He had chosen the chair over the woman, and as the descent began, Janice realized that the hardest part of a second chance wasn't finding love. It was having the courage to keep it when the world tried to tear it from your hands. The silence in the Bukchon studio was no longer the peaceful quiet of creation. It was the heavy, suffocating stillness of an ending. Janice worked with a feverish, mechanical precision. Her hands, once soft against Han-gyul's cheek, were now stained a permanent deep indigo. She was weaving her way out of Korea. Every throw of the shuttle was a heartbeat. Every beat of the reed was a footstep toward the airport. She had already booked her flight back to New York. The moonlight silk was finished, a ghost-white masterpiece that seemed to shiver in the dim light of the studio. But it was the final piece for her exhibition, the second thread, that took the most out of her. It was the piece she hadn't planned. Across the city, in the boardroom of Moonhwa Holdings, Han-gyul sat at the head of a mahogany table that felt miles long. He had won. The merger with Steiner Goetz was back on track. The tabloids had moved on to a fresh scandal involving a K-pop star. His sister, Ji-ah, sat to his left, looking triumphant. The numbers for Q4 are projected to be our highest in history, Ji-ah said, her voice bright with corporate victory. The Black Widow narrative has been successfully buried. Han-gyul looked at his reflection in the polished wood of the table. He saw a man who had everything, and a man who was utterly hollow. The penthouse was once again a sterile gallery of expensive things. He found himself standing in the kitchen at 3 a.m., staring at the spot where Janice used to make coffee, the air smelling only of industrial filtered oxygen. His empire didn't feel like a kingdom anymore. It felt like a tomb. The Garam Gallery held a private, silent viewing of her exhibition. Janice wasn't there. She couldn't bring herself to smile for the critics. Han-gyul arrived after the doors had officially closed to the public. He wore a dark coat and a low-profile cap, slipping past the security he himself paid for. He walked through the white-walled rooms, seeing Janice's life laid bare in fiber. He saw the warp of Marcus, the sturdy, monochromatic pieces of her past. He saw the Jeju blue, the vibrant, salt-crusted textures of their brief escape. Then he reached the final room. In the center of the space, suspended from the ceiling so it seemed to float, was a massive tapestry. It was woven from the rarest materials, the Joseon moonlight silk she had won at auction, intertwined with a raw metallic gold thread and a deep, bruised indigo wool. It was titled The Chairman's Dawn. Han-gyul stood frozen. The piece didn't depict a person, but a feeling. The indigo was dark, almost black in some places, representing the crushing weight of his world, the bruises of a life spent in a golden cage. But weaving through the darkness were veins of gold so bright they seemed to bleed. It was a sky just before the sun breaks the horizon, a moment of transition, of painful beauty, and of hope. It was the most intimate thing anyone had ever given him. She hadn't just seen his power, She had seen his pain. She had captured the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. The look of a man who was finally, agonizingly alive. A small card sat on the pedestal beside it. It wasn't a curator's note. It was a handwritten scrap of paper. The tension was perfect, Han-gyul, but a masterpiece cannot survive in the dark. I am taking my light back to where it is allowed to shine. Han-gyul felt a physical ache in his chest, a jagged tear in the fabric of his composure. He realized then that he had played the game by the old rules, the rules of fear and preservation. He had tried to protect Janice by hiding her, but in doing so, he had insulted the very strength that had drawn him to her. He looked at the bruised sky she had woven for him. He realized that the boardroom, the merger, and the family name were just the warp, the cold, unmoving foundation. But Janice was the weft. She was the color. She was the life. And without the weft, he was just a collection of lonely strings. The boardroom of Moonhua Holdings was a sterile amphitheater of brushed steel and frosted glass. At the center of the long obsidian table sat the elders of the Moon family and the lead directors of the Steiner-Gertz merger. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the cold, metallic tang of an impending execution. Grandmother Moon sat at the far end, her hands folded over a jade-topped cane. "The documents are ready, Han-gyul," she said, her voice a fragile rasp that still commanded the room. "Resign gracefully. Save the stock price. Let the Kang family take the helm, and we will settle your private matters. Quietly." Han-gyul stood. He didn't look like a man about to surrender. He looked like the storm Janice had woven into her tapestry. He placed a sleek silver drive on the table. "I have spent my life following the bloodline," Han-gyul began, his voice echoing with a newfound resonance. "I believed that the strength of this company lay in its traditions and its coldness. But I was wrong." He tapped the drive, and the massive 8K screens on the wall flickered to life. Instead of spreadsheets, they showed a series of internal memos and encrypted bank transfers. "These are the records of the Black Widow leak," Han-gyul said, his eyes locking onto a director from the Kang conglomerate. "A coordinated effort of corporate sabotage and character assassination, funded by our own partners. You didn't just attack a woman I love, you attacked the integrity of Moonhua to lower the valuation for a hostile takeover." The room went white with shock. The murmurs of the directors turned into panicked whispers. "I am not resigning," Han-gyul declared, leaning over the table, "and I am not hiding. You think Janice Vaughn is a weakness? She is the only reason I'm still standing in this room. She taught me that a leader who has no heart has no vision. My private life isn't a scandal. It is the foundation of my strength. If you want a chairman who is a ghost, fire me. But if you want a man who can outmaneuver every enemy you have, then you will accept that the woman at my side is non-negotiable." He didn't wait for a vote. He turned and walked out, leaving the empire in a state of chaotic, silent awe. In the quiet, cedar-scented courtyard of the Bukchon studio, Simone was helping her mother zip the last of her suitcases. The air was heavy with the goodbye that neither wanted to say. The gate creaked open. Han-gyul stood there, his tie gone, his hair disheveled by the soul wind. He looked exhausted, but his eyes were blazing. Simone stepped forward, blocking his path. "You've done enough, haven't you?" she asked, her voice sharp with protective instinct. "She's leaving. The Black Widow is going back to Brooklyn so you can keep your chair." Han-gyul didn't look away. He didn't use his billionaire persona. He simply reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn piece of the indigo-dyed silk Janice had given him in Jeju. "I don't care about the chair," Han-gyul said to Simone, his voice thick with emotion. "I just told the board they could burn the building down if it meant I had to lose her. Simone, I know I am a stranger to you. I know I am not Marcus. But I love your mother with a ferocity that terrifies me. I don't want to replace her past. I want to protect her future." Simone looked at the piece of silk in his hand. She saw the way his fingers shook. Just a tremor. But it was there. This was the most powerful man in the country, and he was falling apart over a scrap of fabric and the hope of a second chance. In that moment, the two sides of Janice's life, the daughter who held the memory of the past and the man who held the promise of the future, finally touched. Simone saw the man her mother saw. She saw the vulnerability beneath the billions. Simone stepped aside, her eyes softening. "She's inside," she whispered. "And Han-gyol? Don't you dare let her get on that plane." Han-gyol nodded, a brief, silent pact made between them. He walked into the studio where Janice was standing by her loom, one last time. "The tension," he said, breathless, repeating the words she had taught him. "It's finally right, Janice. Don't go. Stay and help me weave the rest." Janice turned, her heart leaping as she saw the man who had finally chosen the heart over the heritage. The threads were no longer fraying. They were finally beginning to knit together into a story that was just beginning. 24 hours later. The air at the summit of Namsan was a biting, crystalline cold that tasted of pine and the coming winter. Janice stood against the railing of the observation deck, her hands shoved deep into the pockets of her wool coat. Below her, Seoul was a sea of indigo shadows, the lights of the city flickering like embers in a dying fire. The sky was just beginning to bruise with the first light of dawn, the same bruised indigo she had woven into her tapestry. This was where they had walked after their first real conversation in the Hainic village. Back then, the air had been thick with rain and uncertainty. Now, it was clear and sharp. She heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of the cable car arriving, followed by a set of footsteps she would recognize in a crowded stadium. She didn't turn around. She didn't have to. The air seemed to grow warmer simply because he was standing in it. "I went to the studio," Han-gyol said, his voice roughened by the cold and the sheer exhaustion of the last 24 hours. "Simone told me you were here. She also told me that if I let you leave, she'd personally see to it that I never found peace again." Janice turned then, a small, tired smile playing on her lips. "She's a lawyer, Han-gyol. She's very good at making threats." Han-gyol stepped closer. He wasn't wearing his chairman's overcoat. He looked stripped down. Just a man in a dark sweater, his face lined with the weight of his choices. "I didn't come here to make a plea for the company or to ask you to wait in the shadows until the board calms down. I'm done with shadows." He reached out, his fingers brushing against the wool of her sleeve before finding her hand. His touch was steady. "I have spent my life making acquisitions. I thought love was something you negotiated, something you secured with a contract and a family seal. But you taught me that love is the tension. It's the struggle of the thread. It's the courage to stay on the loom when the world wants to cut you down." He didn't produce a velvet box. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple, heavy band of hammered platinum. Set into the metal was a raw, uncut diamond, gray-veined, asymmetrical, and glowing with an internal, subterranean fire. "It isn't perfect," Han-gyol whispered, looking at the stone. "It hasn't been polished to hide its flaws. It's been under immense pressure for 1 billion years, and it survived. It reminded me of you, of us." Slowly, with a reverence that made Janice's breath hitch, Han-gyol lowered himself onto one knee on the frost-dusted concrete. "Janice Vaughn," he said, looking up at her. At 60 and 57, they were past the age of breathless infatuation, but the intensity in his eyes was more profound than any youthful passion. "I am not offering you a fairy tale. I am offering you a partnership. I am offering you a seat at the head of my table, a place in my home, and every dawn I have left. I don't want to be your happily ever after. I want to be your what comes next. Will you weave your life with mine?" Janice looked down at him, this titan of industry who had knelt in the dirt for her. She thought of Marcus and the beautiful, finished chapter of her past. Then she looked at the raw diamond, a symbol of a chapter that was still being written, messy and brilliant. She felt the strength in her own legs, the clarity in her own mind. She wasn't a girl being rescued. She was a woman being chosen, and more importantly, a woman choosing. Yes, she said, her voice a resonant bell in the morning air. Not because I need you, Hangyol, but because I want you, and because we aren't finished with the masterpiece yet. As he slid the ring onto her finger, the sun finally broke over the horizon. The indigo sky shattered into 1,000 shards of gold and crimson, flooding the tower with light. Hangyol stood and pulled her into his arms, his forehead resting against hers. They stood at the top of the world, two people who had found their greatest treasure, not in the prime of their youth, but in the wisdom of their autumn. The city below was waking up to a scandal, a merger, and a changing empire. But up here, in the golden light of the Namsan dawn, there was only the warp, the weft, and the promise of a beautiful, unyielding strength. The venue was a masterpiece of industrial resurrection. The old Chuncheon silk mill, once a skeletal remain of Korea's textile golden age, had been transformed for one night into a cathedral of light and thread. Towering brick walls were draped in miles of raw silk and vibrant kente patterned tapestries, the intersection of two lineages hanging in perfect, heavy grace. As the sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting a honey glow through the mill's high clear-story windows, the guests, a mix of Seoul's elite and Janice's chosen family from New York, fell into a hush. Hangyol stood at the altar, looking not like a billionaire chairman, but like a man who had finally found home. He wore a deep navy durumagi over a modern tuxedo, the hem embroidered with subtle gold threads. His hands were clasped in front of him, his gaze fixed on the heavy wooden doors at the end of the aisle. When the doors opened, the breath left the room. Janice didn't wear a traditional white gown. She wore a fusion of her own design, a high-waisted shima skirt made of moonlight silk, paired with a bodice of hand-woven African gold thread lace. Her silver hair was swept up in a crown, adorned with small, fresh hibiscus and plum blossoms. She wasn't being given away. She was being escorted. Simone walked beside her, her hand tucked firmly into her mother's arm. There was no trace of the angry daughter left, only a woman who looked at her mother with a fierce, tearful pride. As they reached the halfway point, Simone leaned in and whispered, "He's looking at you like you're the sun, Mom. Go shine." Janice reached the altar, and Hangyol took her hands. His touch was a grounding wire, a promise kept. The ceremony was a quiet blend of traditions. They performed a modified kunbere, the traditional Korean bowing ceremony to honor the elders. Even Grandmother Moon, who sat in the front row with a stiff but undeniable look of begrudging respect. "We are not young," Hangyol said, his voice carrying through the rafters of the mill without the need for a microphone. "We do not have the luxury of ignorance. We know what it costs to love, and we know the weight of the years behind us. But Janice, you are the weft that has given my life its color. I choose you, in the strength of my maturity and the clarity of my soul." Janice's voice was like velvet. "I thought my story was a finished volume, Hangyol. I thought the ink had dried. But you reminded me that a masterpiece isn't finished until the last thread is tied. I choose you as my partner, my equal, and my greatest adventure." As they were declared husband and wife, the mill erupted, not with the polite applause of a corporate function, but with the roar of a celebration that had been earned through fire. During the reception, the loose ends of their former lives were finally knit together. Ji-ah, Hangyol's sister, approached Janice near the garden terrace. She didn't offer an apology. That wasn't her way. But she held up a glass of champagne. The Steiner-Gertz merger was signed an hour ago, Gia said, her eyes meeting Janice's with a new clinical respect. Hangul secured a clause that protects your foundation's arts grants for the next 20 years. You were right, Ms. Vaughn. Or should I say, Mrs. Moon? The empire needed a soul. Just don't let him get too soft. Janice smiled, clinking her glass against Gia's. I think we'll both be just fine, Gia. Hours later, the festivities had faded into a soft memory. The couple returned to the penthouse in the Moonhua Tower. The marble floors were still there. The glass walls still looked over the neon sea of Seoul, but the space was no longer cold. Janice stood by the window, the raw diamond on her finger catching the light of the moon. Hangul came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. The scent of sandalwood and celebration clung to them both. They call this the sunset of our lives, don't they? Hangul whispered, his hands moving over the silk of her skirt. Janice leaned back against him, closing her eyes and feeling the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart against her spine. She looked out at the horizon, where the first faint line of light was beginning to tease the edge of the world. Let them call it whatever they want, Janice replied, turning in his arms to face him. But to me, Hangul, this doesn't feel like an ending at all. He kissed her then, a slow, deep, and beautifully unhurried kiss that tasted of the future. As the sun began to rise over Seoul, painting the glass and the steel in shades of gold and rose, the sunset years of Janice and Hangul Moon looked exactly like a glorious, everlasting dawn. 1 year later, the Moonhua International Center for Textile Arts did not look like the corporate museum it had once been. Under Janice's direction as the founding curator, the sterile white walls had been replaced with reclaimed wood and soft, recessed lighting that mimicked the golden hour of a Brooklyn autumn. Tonight was the opening of the Global Loom, an exhibition that had become the talk of the international art world. It wasn't just a showcase of Janice's work. It was a conversation between Ghanaian kente weavers, Appalachian quilters, and Korean newbie masters. Janice stood in the center of the rotunda, her silver hair pulled back. She wore a power suit of deep plum silk, a gift from Hangul's sister, Ji-ah, who had become an unlikely ally in the foundation's expansion. The light is perfect, Mom, a voice said behind her. Janice turned to see Simone. Her daughter had transitioned from a skeptic to a frequent visitor, currently spending a month in Seoul to consult on international intellectual property for the foundation. Simone looked vibrant, her eyes no longer searching for the ghost of her father, but resting comfortably on the happiness of her mother. It's not just the light, Janice whispered, squeezing Simone's hand. It's the tension. Look. She pointed to the centerpiece of the rotunda, the moonlight silk. The fabric was no longer just a bolt of vintage cloth. Janice had spent the last 12 months embroidering it with a technique that combined West African storytelling motifs with traditional Korean jigakbo, patchwork. The result was a shimmering, translucent map of a life lived in two halves, joined by a golden seam. As the gala reached its peak, Hangul made his way through the crowd of ambassadors and artists. He didn't move with the stiff, defensive posture of the Ice King anymore. He moved like a man who was comfortable in his skin. He found Janice near a display of indigo-dyed hemp. Without a word, he slipped his hand into hers, his thumb tracing the hammered platinum of her wedding band. The board is asking if we can tour this exhibition in London next spring, he whispered in her ear, his breath warm. And what did the chairman tell them? Janice asked, tilting her head toward him. The chairman told them that the curator-in-chief makes the schedule. Hangul smiled, a genuine, relaxed expression that had become his new trademark, and that she is currently unavailable for comment because she is busy being the most beautiful woman in the room. Janice laughed, a rich, soulful sound that echoed off the high ceilings. You've gotten very good at the supportive spouse role, Hangul. I have a very good teacher, he replied. Later that night, the crowds were gone. The museum was dark, save for the security lights reflecting off the silk. Janice and Hangul sat on a low bench in the gallery, sharing a quiet moment of reflection. Do you ever miss the quiet? Hangul asked, looking at the vibrant multicultural world they had built together, the way it was before the auction. Janice leaned her head on his shoulder, her eyes fixed on the moonlight silk. The quiet wasn't peace, Hangul. It was just a lack of noise. This is music. She reached out and touched a small, intentional flaw she had woven into the corner of the masterpiece, a knot of crimson thread that symbolized the bruise of their struggle. At 60, Janice said softly, I thought the weaving was done. I thought I was just supposed to look at the pattern I'd already made, but you showed me that we can always add a new color. We can always change the weft. Hangul turned to her, his gaze intense and full of a love that had only deepened with the passing of the seasons. Then let's keep weaving, Janice. We have a lot of silk left. They sat in the heart of their empire, not an empire of stocks and steel, but one of art, heritage, and a love that had defied every boundary. As the moon rose over Seoul, its light hit the moonlight silk, making the fabric glow as if it were lit from within. It was a second chance made manifest, a masterpiece that proved that no matter how late the hour, the most beautiful part of the story is the thread you choose to add next. The end. Thank you for watching. If you love this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more emotional twists and character-driven plots. And if you're ready for the next story, make sure to turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Until next time, keep believing in love that defies all odds.